And so it's part of why it's so different than what I envisioned is that we don't spend our time talking about alcohol. Alcohol really is the symptom of what's working and not working in our life. Welcome to the Sober Edge podcast, inspiration for alcohol-free living. I'm your host, Terry Patterson, functional nutritionist and This Naked Mind senior coach. The Sober Edge is a place to explore the infinite possibilities on the other side of drinking. In a culture soaked in booze, discover the wonder and joy of taking a different path. Meet real people living lives of purpose and passion. Learn the truth behind the alcohol myths and get ready to be motivated, inspired, and astounded by what is possible with the Sober Edge. You're listening to episode 159 of the Sober Edge podcast. Welcome to today's episode. I'm your host, Terry Patterson, alcohol freedom coach, functional nutritionist, and someone who just is enjoying loving and living in midlife. So this is a place where all of these things in my life get to intersect here on the Sober Edge podcast, and I'm so glad that you're here. So today I want to not talk about alcohol. And what I mean by that is this conversation that I had, it's been about a year now that I actually had this conversation, maybe 2 years. And a family member asked me, so what is it that you do in your coaching calls? And when you get on a call with someone week after week, do you just talk about drinking and not drinking? And I had to chuckle a little bit and laugh because when I was training to be an alcohol freedom coach, that's what I thought too. I thought, well, I'm going to deliver tactics and we're going to dissect, their week. And sometimes we do that. But the reality is, and what I shared with my nephew was, no, actually, we spend very little time talking about drinking. We spend time talking instead about what is underneath the drinking. And it's really true about life in general. Anytime we're struggling with something and seeking a change and feeling some discomfort around what's serving us and what's not serving us, it is those underlying issues, those underlying feelings, emotions, behaviors that are really at the heart of our alcohol consumption. And so let's not talk about alcohol. Instead, let's talk about what's underneath the drinking. And I've said it before, and I think there's even a podcast entitled Behavior Comes Last, because what I've realized is that this journey toward changing your relationship with alcohol is so much less about the behavior of drinking and so much more about the thoughts, the emotions, and the reality of how we're showing up day to day than it is about picking up the glass or opening the bottle. And for people who are trying to explore whether coaching is right for them, that is an awkward place. We think that the way to change our relationship is to not drink. And I'm here to say yes and no. And so what I think is so fun is to just explore this idea of let's talk about drinking by not talking about the behavior of drinking. And so let's dive in a little bit. So one of the things that I've said before, and I'll share today, is this idea of understanding why we drink. And one of my friends early on in my alcohol freedom training, we were at coach training together, and she said something I'd never heard before. She said, I gave alcohol a job. And then I gave it another job and another job and another job. And so when you are starting to think about why am I drinking more than I want to, ask yourself, what job am I giving to alcohol? sometimes I'll say, what hat? How many hats is alcohol wearing? And so for me, I was really giving alcohol the job of kind of soothing my discomfort, soothing some of my dissatisfaction, soothing some of my disappointments in life. And so I was at a place in my mid 50s and early 50s where life was kind of just ticking along by default. And I found that alcohol was showing up as a place where I could disconnect from my real life and sort of be in this foggy place where I didn't really check in with myself. I didn't really allow myself to feel the deeper feelings or feel that disappointment. And so that was one way that I used alcohol. And that might be one of the ways that you're using alcohol. You might be using alcohol as a stress relief. You might be using alcohol to help you, quote unquote, sleep at night. You might be using alcohol to connect with the people in your social group, or it might be part of your primary relationship with your significant other, your partner, your spouse. It might be the way that you connect. It might be the only way that you have fun anymore. And I think that this is a beautiful place to start. So if we look at our whole life, and this is what we really do in coaching, is, we have to say, like, what's happening for you in the places where alcohol is showing up. If we think about our life and we see some cracks in our life, we see some places where we feel disconnected or we feel torn and there's cracks, and we're using alcohol as that putty to fill the crack. What are those cracks? What is it that's happening? Are we in a stressful job? Is our career creating this increasingly difficult place where we are struggling to go to work every day, or we feel like we're trading time for money and we feel some sense of dissatisfaction about that? And so this opportunity to look at alcohol is really just a wake-up call for all of our life. And always, I think the second thing we need to do is look at, well, what are the thoughts that I'm telling myself around alcohol and around my life? So if we first of all look at the jobs that we're giving to alcohol, then we can look at what are the stories that are coming up in my life, like this is as good as it gets, or this is all there is, or so many other people have it worse off, or I should be grateful for what I do have, or things aren't that bad. And so you can see that this conversation in our head is about so much more than should I buy Chardonnay or Cabernet. And this is why it's so important to not talk about alcohol and to have this conversation around, wait a minute, if I was to zoom out and look at my life from this big perspective, what would it look like? What is it that I see from this top-down view of how am I going through my days? How am I feeling? What is it I'm paying attention to? Where am I spending my time? What lights me up? Do I even know what lights me up? So recently I was at a beautiful event, Sober in the City in Seattle, Washington, and I went early the night before the event started because there was a special offering. And there was this beautiful dinner curated by Elise Bryson, who is the sober curator. And her and I had a lovely podcast conversation a while back. So I'll link that in the show notes. But she invited all of us who'd been to the dinner to partake in one of her favorite things to do in the Seattle area. And that was to experience something called, I think it's called Soaring Over Washington. I'll have to look. Wings Over Washington, perhaps. And if you've ever been to California Adventure, the Disneyland part of the California part of Disneyland at their adventure park, they have something called Soaring Over California. And so I had experienced this before, but I had not been at Wings over Washington. And so basically, you're sitting in a sort of a swing, and then there's an IMAX theater in front of you, and you get to you're raised in the air, so you have this beautiful perspective from above, and you swoop and dive and experience all the things that are happening in the state of Washington, from the beautiful mountains to waterfalls to crabbing and fishing and just all of the things that forests that you might not see in just the Seattle area, but it was really fun. And if we think about that experience, what we're doing there is we are looking down from above and we're experiencing all of the rush of emotion and thrill that comes from looking at this beautiful landscape below us. And so, what if you were to zoom out from your life and say, like, if I'm soaring over my life, if I'm looking down from above, what do I see? What are the things that are thrilling? Where is the beauty? And that's what we get to think about and explore and talk about in the container of looking at our relationship with alcohol. And so it's part of why it's so different than what I envisioned, is that we don't spend our time talking about alcohol. Alcohol really is the symptom of what's working and not working in our life. And I'll say working because in the beginning, I think that, for me certainly, and for many of my clients, alcohol works in the sense that we're enjoying it, we're having a little bit of fun now and then. It shows up occasionally. There's no deep connection to alcohol. It just sort of occasionally maybe have a cocktail or a drink. And it's when things start to get challenging around the other areas of our life and things are fraying a little bit and real life starts to creep in, that we start to notice that perhaps alcohol takes on more significance. And this idea of tolerance, where we're drinking more to feel the same, this idea of using alcohol for the putty that fills in those cracks, this is where things can start to change. And so we really have to look at our entire life in order to change our relationship with alcohol. And I know that might sound daunting, but I will say there's a couple of things that happened. And so I want to give you hope and encouragement to explore what's really happening. And I also want to say that for me, this sounded very difficult. I didn't want to look deeper. I didn't want to pull back the covers of the things that I had been covering up. I didn't want to peek underneath. That felt hard and scary. And I told myself for a long time, is it really necessary? I think things are good enough. But I have a saying that I share with clients sometimes, and it's when they tell me that things are fine. And I always want to say, wow, let's look at that. Is fine all you want? Is fine enough? And I often will say, I never want to leave you at fine, because I think that the beautiful parts of this life are more than fine, and the hard parts are more than fine. And so this rich tapestry of beauty and pain and emotion and depth and all of it, they are more than fine. And so if your life is fine, it's time perhaps to take that closer look. And if alcohol is showing up to keep your life small and to keep it fine and to hold things together, I trained with Annie Grace, and one of the things she said that resonated with me then and still resonates with me today is that she really felt like alcohol was the duct tape that was holding her life together. And so if your life feels fine, Is alcohol part of that? Is alcohol actually showing up in a way that is keeping fine in this place where it's good enough? And what I mean by that is, what if you explored changing that relationship with alcohol? What else would change? And so I think the third thing is to really ask yourself, like, what would it look like if my life had less alcohol in it? What would change? Would I be more present? Would I have more time? Would I have more energy? Would I meet new people? Would I perhaps take more risks? Would I save a little bit of money and put that into something else? Would I get to know me as I was before I started drinking? That interruption that was part of my life where I was spending too much time drinking, now I see this beautiful through line of who I was before I got sidetracked or derailed by drinking too much, and who I am now. And yes, that piece in the middle was powerful and important. There was lovely parts of it. I had 3 children and I have 3 grandchildren. And I mean, all of that is not is not to be thrown out because I drank during much of that time. Instead, it's now I get to build on what I know of myself and what I learned along the way. This process of changing our relationship with alcohol is so much more than one day at a time. One day at a time reminds me of this idea of constantly being in the work. And it's why I have a love-hate relationship with the word recovery, because I think that recovery sounds like this daunting, constant work. And I don't see my life like that. That's not my experience. That's not how I feel about it. I don't think it's true for my life. And so we don't have to stay in this place where one day at a time is forcing us to be in this conversation about alcohol day in and day out. And so I want to invite you to consider not talking about alcohol, but instead allowing yourself to explore where is my life right now? What's working? What feels so good? What lights me up? What is hard? And how am I getting through these days? And am I using alcohol in a way that isn't serving me? That instead of allowing me to build this big, bold, beautiful life by design, it's keeping me in this place where things are fine. And so I hope that's helpful for you today. I was just struck by this idea of not talking about alcohol. And do I talk with my clients about tactics? Absolutely. Do we talk about what we learn if we have a drink in the course of our time together? Do we talk about the cravings? Do we talk about the routines? Absolutely. All of that is part of it. But I want to remind you that there is so much more that weighs into this place of drinking and not drinking. And it's a beautiful place to take a closer look, because guess what? On the other side, you are discovering you. You get to discover the parts of you that are more than fine, that are beautiful and deep and rich. And it is an incredible experience. And so if you think that you don't want to explore your relationship with alcohol because you're going to have to be hyper focused on the behavior of drinking and talk about all of the things about drinking and not drinking, and it feels very challenging, I want to invite you to think about it differently. I want you to invite you to not think or talk about not drinking. I want to invite you to be in this beautiful opportunity of not focusing on drinking or not drinking, but instead focusing on what's next. Thank you for tuning in today. It's my pleasure to spend this time with you, and I can't wait to do it all again in another week. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Sober Edge podcast. This is a place for important conversations and a safe place to question everything you thought you knew about drinking. If you're looking for your sober edge, I want to invite you to connect with me at thesobernutritionist.com, where you can grab my free resource, Becoming More, a guide to loving your sober life. And I would be so grateful if you enjoyed this podcast, if you would leave a rating and review, as it will help more people find their sober edge.